Everything has changed in the presidential race since the debate. And maybe nothing has? All eyes are on the Democratic National Convention on August 19th. Will Democrats move on from Joe Biden? Can they? The two parties aren't part of our federal government or our Constitution, so who decides how they operate? And how do they operate? We will answer all of those questions and more with today's video. Join us as we bring you through a story with assassinations, backroom deals, secret plots, and not one, but two Robert F. Kennedys. Let's go.
My name is Mac Latimer, and this is Imagine Better.
The history of presidential primaries starts in 1968. Before then, parties chose their nominees in sometimes quite literal smoke-filled rooms. Some states had primaries, and some states had caucuses, but they only exist to show party insiders that candidates had popular support. But the 1968 Democratic primary changed everything. Let's introduce our cast of characters. First, we have Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, the sitting president. What you need to know is that he hated the Kennedys, and the Kennedys hated him. LBJ ran against JFK in the 1960 primary, and the only reason Kennedy made LBJ the vice president was to unify the party. You also need to know that LBJ was pro-Vietnam War. Second, we have Hubert Humphreys. He's LBJ's vice president and is also pro-war. Third, we have Robert F. Kennedy Sr., or RFK. He was Attorney General under JFK, his brother, and he was anti-war. Our fourth major character is Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war senator from Minnesota. Finally, we have George McGovern, a pro-Kennedy, anti-war senator from South Dakota. At the beginning of 1968, McCarthy and Johnson were the only candidates in the race. One was anti-war, one pro-war. Johnson led handily in polls at the time. At this time, only 13 states even conducted primaries, and only 9 of those assigned delegates based on those results. In quick succession, LBJ's poll numbers plunged after the Tet Offensive in February. Eugene McCarthy won 42% of the New Hampshire primary as a write-in candidate. RFK got in the race in March. Johnson dropped out on March 31st and endorsed Hubert Humphrey when he got in the race in April. So now we have a three-way race, but what we really have is two different races. Kennedy and McCarthy were running races to convince Democratic voters to support them. Humphrey was running a race for delegates. Humphrey didn't contest the primaries, and he didn't join the debate with Kennedy and McCarthy. He sat down with influential people in each state and vied for their votes at the convention. You know the next part of the story. RFK comes off a huge win in the California primary and is assassinated the next day. George McGovern tries to enter the race in Kennedy's stead, but it's the convention that changes everything. At convention, Hubert Humphrey won an absolute majority of the delegates' votes in a three-way race. In an environment where the left was overwhelmingly against the Vietnam War, and even Richard Nixon ran an anti-war campaign, a pro-war candidate won the Democratic nomination without participating in any of the primaries. The activists on the left were furious, and George McGovern gave them their victory. Amid the chaos of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, George McGovern, who was on the Rules Committee, proposed creating a commission to change the nominating process. As most delegates were pro-Humphrey, the Rules Committee voted this commission down, but McGovern took it to the body as a minority report. A minority report is just a way to bring something to the vote of the whole convention if it fails in committee. Historians disagree about this next part. Some say McGovern whipped the votes using the same kind of backroom deals that Humphrey made to win the nomination. Others say there was mass confusion on the convention floor and it actually passed accidentally. Either way, it passed, and George McGovern went on to lead the McGovern-Fraser Commission. This commission recommended many reforms, but the one that changed everything called for states to open their processes for assigning delegates. In response, states moved en masse to adopt either primaries or caucuses, and by 1972, 25 states had done so. One state made such a convoluted multi-stage caucus system that they had to move the first round of their caucuses before any other state. But more about that later. 16 major candidates entered the primary in 1972 because for the first time, a candidate could win the nomination without establishment backing. The parties, yes, Republicans too, were now Democratic for the first time. Since most of these reforms actually happened in state law, the Republican Party had to adhere to them as well. George McGovern went on to win the nomination and lose the presidency to Nixon in a historic fashion. He later said that he had opened up the doors to the Democratic Party, and 20 million people walked out. Even with this failure, primaries and caucuses were here to stay, and the fight between the establishment and the grassroots was just heating up. In 1976, we had the first primary election in which every state either held a primary or a caucus. Jimmy Carter won the nomination as a grassroots candidate by pioneering what we call the Iowa strategy. Carter proved that an unknown candidate could win the nomination by putting all his eggs in the Iowa basket and use the momentum from that win to take the nomination. Since Carter, only Bill Clinton and Joe Biden have ever lost both Iowa and New Hampshire and still won their party's nomination. On the Republican side, Gerald Ford, the establishment candidate, won the nomination against a grassroots conservative challenger, Ronald Reagan. This race was the last time that a major party nominee had not clinched the nomination by convention. In 1980, Carter barely won his race against an establishment challenger, Ted Kennedy. And this time, it was the Republicans' turn to have a grassroots nominee in Ronald Reagan. In the first general election with two grassroots candidates, Republicans won in a landslide. At the Democratic National Convention that year, the establishment struck back. North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt started a commission to figure out how to take power back from the grassroots. That commission recommended the creation of superdelegates. Superdelegates gain their status as delegates by position, not by votes. The party split these superdelegate slots between state chairs, vice chairs, Democratic congressmen, and other prominent elected officials. At first, these delegates comprised 14% of the delegate count, but grew to 20% at their peak. In 1984, the Democratic establishment finally figured out the system. After Ted Kennedy announced that he wouldn't run, the establishment backed Walter Mondale with support and funding. Even with several challengers, he never trailed in the primary. The next contest in 1988 would mark the first time since the 1968 reforms that both parties would have a competitive primary without an incumbent. On the Democratic side, the presumptive nominee, Gary Hart, who was the grassroots challenger to Walter Mondale, dropped out of the race after an extramarital affair became public. Then a lesser-known candidate, Joe Biden, the senator from Delaware, dropped out after plagiarizing a speech, and the media uncovered plagiarism from his law school days. With no establishment favorite, Michael Dukakis won the nomination over second-place finisher Jesse Jackson. On the Republican side, meanwhile, George H.W. Bush ran on Ronald Reagan's record and won handily. A real estate developer named Donald Trump considered entering the Republican primary that year, making 1988 the first year where both of our candidates from this year started running for president. In 1992, the Democrats once again had no establishment favorite. Because of Bush's 89% approval rating, Democrats thought that he was unbeatable, pushing establishment candidates out of the race. A little-known candidate named Bill Clinton came from behind, won a majority of delegates, and clinched the nomination from Jerry Brown and Paul Tsongas. On the Republican side, George H.W. Bush had a conservative challenger in Pat Buchanan, who didn't win a single state, but ran strong enough to convince Ross Perot to mount a third-party challenge. In 1996, the establishment candidate Bob Dole won the nomination against two grassroots challengers, Pat Buchanan and Steve Forbes. In 2000, the Democratic primary was barely competitive, with the establishment coalescing early around Al Gore, who won every single state. On the Republican side, George W. Bush wrapped up establishment funding and support early and won the nomination in a landslide. 2000 was the peak year for establishment control of the primaries. Republicans hadn't picked a grassroots candidate since Reagan in 1980, and the Democrats had finally coalesced early behind their nominee in Al Gore. In 2004, the Democrats saw what was about to change everything: the internet. Howard Dean gained early support as an anti-war candidate who was explicitly running against the Democratic establishment. His key to success was campaigning and fundraising through the internet. Dean led many polls in 2003 and even outspent every candidate in Iowa and New Hampshire. However, through a combination of negative advertising and bad luck, he drove away enough support to lose both contests and handed the nomination to John Kerry. In 2008, the Democratic Party saw the best example of the establishment versus the grassroots. The establishment lined up early behind Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama used the internet and supporters like Oprah to gain grassroots support. The primary was hard fought the whole way through, but Barack Obama clinched the nomination in June with the help of superdelegates. Many of these superdelegates switched support from Hillary Clinton to Barack Obama because they didn't want to be seen as rigging the system. On the Republican side, the advent of winner take all primaries shortened the primary significantly. State parties could choose to allocate delegates however they wanted to based on the primaries. So several state parties moved to winner take all contests to increase the importance of their state in the primary process. Although there was no clear establishment candidate, John McCain wrapped up the contest by March 4th because of these winner take all primaries. Despite a competitive race, Mitt Romney, the second place finisher in 2008 and the clear establishment favorite, won the nomination in 2012 over a heavily splintered field. In 2016, the Democrats once again got behind Hillary Clinton, and this time it worked. The Republicans, on the other hand, had the largest field in history with 17 major candidates and no establishment consensus pick. With such a diverse field and so many winner-take-all states, Donald Trump won the Republican nomination with the lowest percentage of primary voters since the primary process began. Not to be outdone, the Democrats had 29 major candidates in their 2020 primary. Joe Biden led in the polls for most of 2020, but badly lost the first three contests to Bernie Sanders. No one knows exactly what happened in backroom deals after that, but the two major moderate candidates running dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden. This consolidation happened despite both candidates performing better than Joe Biden in the early primaries. Biden went on to win handily. We have finally reached the present day and are seeing a rematch between Trump and Biden. Both handily won their primaries, but haven't yet had the conventions that would make their nominations final. It's in front of that backdrop that the worst debate in presidential history occurred. CNN hosted a debate between Trump and Biden melted down. Biden stumbled over simple concepts and at some times was utterly unintelligible. Since then, support for Biden has plummeted in the polls, and major Democrats have come out of the woodwork and asked him to step down, allowing delegates to vote for whoever they want at convention. This convention would be the first time that the nominee was unknown going into convention since 1976 with Ford and Reagan. It would also be the first time that the parties would pick a nominee without the assistance of primaries since 1968. But that's if Biden steps down before convention on August 19th. What happens if he doesn't? The crazy thing is that anything could happen. Before the Democratic National Convention will vote on its nominees, it'll vote on its rules. That's right, delegates actually set the rules for the primary after the primary occurs. The Rules Committee could decide that delegates could vote for whoever they wanted to in the nomination fight. As long as most delegates agree, the nomination would be open. Even if the convention keeps the rules the same, delegates are allowed to, in all good conscience, reflect the sentiments of those who elected them. This rule means that delegates can vote for someone else in extreme circumstances, creating a contested convention. Those options are extreme, but definitely within the realm of possibility after that debate and the subsequent interviews. This past week has shown just how fragile our nominating process is. So let's spell out the problems. The first problem, and the one that all future problems flow from, is that the primary process was not thought out. The process was born from the chaos of 1968, from states wielding their power of ballot access over state parties, and from reforms that offered small fixes for large structural problems. The second problem is predictability. With delegates setting rules at convention, presumptive nominees have to trust those delegates to not change the rules before the nominating contest. The third problem is a lack of purpose. The structure of the nominating process doesn't actively optimize for party voters' opinions, swing voters' opinions, ideological purity, electability, or anything that the party might want to optimize for. So how do the parties fix this? The first thing that they need to do is choose what to optimize for. They can choose multiple goals, but they need to choose. Then they can design a system. If they want to optimize for electability, they could add weight to battleground state votes, and they could also allow swing voters to vote in primaries. If they want to optimize for ideological purity, they could limit the people that vote in primaries, and they could require debate attendance. If they want to optimize for fundraising, they could require donations to participate in the primary. So here's my solution, at least for the Republican Party. I want the party to optimize for long-term growth of the party, and here's how we do that. We give everyone one vote that's weighted the same. If we only focus on battleground states, we will slowly lose the red states and never pick up the blue ones. Then we require voters to be registered to vote in the general election and donate something like $10 to participate in the process. Make the dollar amount small enough to where it's not a burden, but it's large enough to where you won't have Democratic saboteurs participating in the process. Then you set a timeline of 6 months for candidates to compete, say from July 1st to December 31st. This would allow the eventual nominee to run a 10-month general election campaign. The party will then set up an online voting system to track real-time votes while protecting the secrecy of your ballot. Cryptographic technology exists today that could make something like that happen. Voters would then be able to cast their votes as soon as July 1st and change their votes up until December 31st. This would enable the measure of real-time support rather than relying on polls. The RNC would host monthly debates, slowly narrowing the field until there are just 2 candidates on December 31st. Then, on August 1st, you would narrow the field to candidates who had just received 1% of the vote, and the RNC would hold the first debate. The leading candidate would then be the nominee. An example of the schedule could be something like this, slowly narrowing the candidates down one by one. The slow winnowing of the field would prevent a fractional or establishment candidate from just running away with the nomination and would reward candidates that brought people into the party. The eventual nominee would then have the backing of a strong, well-funded party that had a base that it could turn out in November. The only thing left would be a safety valve in case of an emergency. The party could keep voting open, and if at any time 4/5 of the body supported reopening nomination, they could. So what do you think? Would that system be too convoluted? Let me know in the comments. If you made it to the end, thank you so much, and here's how you can help us. First, you can click the like button and the subscription and notification buttons if you're on YouTube. Then you can go into the show notes of this video and follow Imagine Better Media on all of the social media platforms that you use regularly. After that, please share us with as many people as possible, both in person and online. Finally, you can go to imaginebettermedia.com and sign up for one of our subscriptions. Thank you to our VIP subscribers who help make these videos possible. Let's imagine better and make it happen. And while you're here, you can click here to check out our other stories.